When Ronald Reed died, his neighbors were stunned to learn he'd left behind $8 million. He wasn't an investor. He wasn't a banker. He spent his life pumping gas and sweeping floors at a J. Penney, wearing the same coat for years because he didn't see the point in replacing it. Most people who knew him assumed he was simply getting by, the way most ordinary working people do. Around the same time, a Merrill Lynch executive named Richard Fuscone, Harvard-educated, brilliant by any measure, the kind of resume that gets you into rooms most people never see, filed for bankruptcy after losing nearly everything he'd built. Same country, same decade, completely opposite outcomes from completely opposite starting points. Morgan Housel built an entire book around explaining that gap. This is the psychology of money. Picture this. You've made a financial decision you still think about, a purchase you regret, an investment you panicked out of too early, a habit you know is costing you and somehow can't quite break, no matter how many times you've told yourself this month will be different. You're smart. You know the numbers. You could probably explain compound interest to a stranger without hesitation, and somehow knowing the numbers never seemed to be the part that actually mattered when it came time to actually make the decision. Housel's argument starts here. Financial success isn't a hard science. It's a soft skill, closer to how you behave under pressure than how well you understand a spreadsheet. Ronald Reed's secret wasn't a secret at all. He simply saved consistently, invested in stable companies, and left the money alone for decades. Through every crash, every recession, every reason a smarter person might have panicked and pulled out. Richard Fuscone had access to information, connections, and financial sophistication Ronald Reed never had. And none of it protected him, because intelligence was never the actual variable that mattered. Housel's point isn't that intelligence is worthless. It's narrower and far more uncomfortable. A person with modest knowledge and excellent behavior will consistently outperform a brilliant person with poor behavior, because money decisions get made not in a classroom, but in moments of fear, excitement, boredom, and social pressure. The exact conditions intelligence alone doesn't prepare you for. Picture two investors during a market crash. One has a finance degree, watches the numbers fall in real time, and sells everything in a panic. Certain this time is different. The other has never read a financial textbook in his life, doesn't check his portfolio more than twice a year, and simply leaves it alone the way he always has. A decade later, the untrained investor's patience has quietly outperformed the trained investor's panic, not because he understood the market better, but because he never let a bad week override a decades-long plan. Here's an idea Housel insists on that most financial advice quietly ignores. Every visible success story contains an invisible amount of luck, and every visible failure contains an invisible amount of risk that simply didn't pay off this time. Bill Gates attended one of the only high schools in the world with a computer in 1968. A circumstance of pure luck that put him on a path almost nobody else had access to. Housel doesn't use this to diminish Gates's success. He uses it to argue that copying the visible behavior of successful people without accounting for the invisible luck underneath it leads people to chase strategies that worked for reasons that had nothing to do with the strategy itself. The same applies in reverse. Someone who made a reckless bet and lost everything isn't always a worse decision maker than someone who made an equally reckless bet and happened to win. Housel's advice: judge the decision, not just the outcome, because outcomes are loud, and the luck or risk underneath them is almost always silent. Picture two entrepreneurs who each bet their entire savings on identical, equally risky business ideas in the same year, with the same odds of success on paper. One launches just before an unexpected wave of demand for exactly what they're selling and becomes a case study in business school. The other launches into a market that quietly shifts the other direction and becomes a cautionary tale at dinner parties. Strip away the outcome and look only at the decision itself, and the two are nearly identical. Housel's point is that we almost never strip away the outcome. We judge the decision by how it turned out, which means we're constantly learning the wrong lessons from both successes and failures alike. Here's where the book turns from observation to genuine advice. Housel argues that the single most dangerous force in personal finance is the moving goalpost, the quiet, constant redefinition of enough upward every time you get slightly closer to it. People with vast fortunes have destroyed everything taking risks they didn't need to take, purely because they'd never actually decided what enough looked like, and so there was always a reason to risk it for more. The opposite of this isn't ambition. It's a deliberately chosen ceiling, a specific point where a person decides in advance that they have what they need and stops letting the goalpost drift simply because drifting felt natural. Without that decision, Housel argues, no amount of money is ever actually enough because the target was never fixed in the first place. Housel tells the story of a hedge fund manager who had already made more money than he could spend in several lifetimes and still took on enormous additional risk chasing more. Risk that eventually wiped out a fortune most people would have considered more than sufficient at any point along the way. The failure wasn't a lack of financial knowledge. It was the absence of a single, deliberately chosen number that would have let him simply stop. There's a line near the end of this book that reframes the entire argument Housel has been building, and it's worth slowing down for. He writes that doing well with money has a little to do with how smart you are, and a lot to do with how you behave. And that behavior is hard to teach, even to really smart people, even to people who'd score perfectly on any financial literacy test you handed them. Sit with that for a second, because it cuts against almost everything traditional financial education assumes. We're taught spreadsheets, formulas, compound interest calculations, the hard skills. We're almost never taught how to sit still during a market crash, or how to feel content with enough while everyone around us chases more, or how to separate a good decision from a lucky one. Ronald Read never needed a finance degree. He needed patience, consistency, and a complete indifference to what anyone else thought about his coat, his car, or his quiet, unremarkable life. Nobody at the gas station where he worked knew what he was quietly building because nothing about his daily behavior was designed to be noticed. That's the real argument of this book, not a strategy, a behavior available to almost anyone, regardless of how smart, how educated, or how much money they started with. Housel isn't arguing. Intelligence doesn't matter at all. He's arguing it was never the bottleneck for most people in the way they assumed it was. Somewhere in the last few minutes, you probably thought of a financial decision that wasn't actually about the numbers, a moment where fear, excitement, or pressure made the call instead of logic. Maybe it was recent. Maybe it's been sitting there for years, quietly explaining a habit you've never quite been able to name. Housel's argument doesn't ask you to get smarter about money. It asks you to get more honest about your own behavior under pressure, which is a very different and much more achievable kind of work, closer to noticing a pattern than learning a new formula. If this gave you something worth thinking about, subscribe, because the next video on this channel might be the next piece of behavior nobody ever clearly named for you either. See you in the next one.